She was a 13-year-old girl who wrote in a diary. She described her fears, her dreams, her crushes, and her desperate hope that the world would one day be good again. Anne Frank spent 2 years hiding in a concealed annex behind a bookcase in Amsterdam, and her words have since been read by hundreds of millions of people in more than 70 languages. But Anne's story did not end when she picked up her pen, nor did it end when Nazi soldiers dragged her from her hiding place in August 1944. It ended in the mud and typhus of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in the early spring of 1945, just weeks before the war itself came to a close. And yet, even after that devastating ending, the story of the Frank family was far from over. What happened to the people who surrounded Anne? What became of her father, the one man who walked out of the gates of Auschwitz alive? What happened to the courageous helpers who risked everything to hide 8 people for more than 2 years? What became of the other families who shared that secret annex, pressed together in darkness and silence while the world outside burned? And what about the extended Frank family? The aunts and uncles and cousins scattered across Europe, each carrying their own extraordinary story of survival, loss, and the long, difficult road towards something resembling a normal life. In this video, we will follow every thread of the Frank family story beyond the pages of the diary, beyond the moment of arrest, beyond the liberation of the camps, and into the decades that followed. We will meet survivors who rebuilt their lives from nothing, encounter mysteries that have never been fully solved, and discover how a young girl's private thoughts transformed the world long after her death. So, without further ado, let's start with the man at the center of it all. Otto Heinrich Frank was born on May 12, 1889, in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, into a wealthy and assimilated Jewish banking family. The Frank household was cultured, educated, and deeply patriotic in the German tradition. Otto and his 3 siblings, Robert, Herbert, and Helene, grew up surrounded by books, music, and the comfortable certainty that they were part of German society in every meaningful way. Otto served as a lieutenant in the German army during the First World War, seeing action on the Western Front at the Battle of the Somme. He was proud of that service. Germany was his country and he believed in it. It would take the full force of National Socialism to strip that belief away. After the First World War, Otto returned to Frankfurt and attempted to rebuild the family banking business, which had suffered badly during the economic chaos of the Weimar Republic years. He married Edith Hollander on May 12, 1925, his own 36th birthday, in Aachen. The couple had 2 daughters, Margot Betty Frank, born on February 16, 1926, and Anneliese Marie Frank, born on June 12, 1929. By the early 1930s, with Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party rising rapidly in German politics, Otto began to recognize the danger gathering around his family. He was methodical, careful, and not given to panic, but he was also clear-eyed about what the political temperature in Germany meant for Jewish families. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Otto had already been exploring options for his family's future outside Germany. He moved first to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, establishing a business dealing in pectin, a substance used in jam making, and later pivoting to a spice and herb trading company called Opekta. Edith and the girls followed him in late 1933, settling into an apartment on Meerweidplein in Amsterdam's River Quarter neighbourhood. For several years, life in Amsterdam was stable, even pleasant. The girls attended school, made friends, learned Dutch, and Otto's business grew. But the long arm of Nazi Germany eventually reached the Netherlands too. Germany invaded and occupied the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, and the net began to close around Amsterdam's Jewish community with terrible efficiency. By the summer of 1942, with deportations to concentration camps accelerating and Jewish families disappearing from Amsterdam's streets with numbing regularity, Otto Frank had been quietly preparing a hiding place. He had taken several trusted employees at his Prinsengracht 263 office into his confidence, and together they had outfitted a set of rooms at the back of the building's upper floors, hidden behind a movable bookcase as a concealed living space. On July 6, 1942, one day after Margot received a call-up notice to report for a so-called labour camp, the Frank family slipped away from their apartment early in the morning and disappeared into what Anne would later call the secret annex. They were joined a week later by Herman and Augusta van Pels and their son Peter, and in November 1942 by a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer. For the next 761 days, 8 People lived in those cramped, silent rooms, depending entirely on the bravery and ingenuity of a small circle of helpers on the outside. And then, on the morning of August 4th, 1944, it all ended. Someone had betrayed them. The German security police arrived at Prinsengracht 263 and arrested all 8 people in the annex, along with 2 of the helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Viktor Kugler. The identity of the betrayer has been debated and investigated for decades, and we will return to that haunting mystery later in this video. But first, we must follow the Franks themselves through the machinery of Nazi deportation and into the camps. Otto Frank was 55 years old when he arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on September 5th or 6th, 1944, transported in one of the last cattle car convoys to make that journey before the deportations from the Netherlands finally ceased. He had been separated from his wife and daughters almost immediately. The men were processed into Auschwitz, the women into Birkenau. Otto would not see his wife and daughters again. In the months that followed, as Allied forces pressed closer to German-held territory from both east and west, Otto endured the brutal conditions of Auschwitz. He was put to work, survived the selections, and managed through a combination of resilience, luck, and the protection of fellow prisoners to avoid the gas chambers that consumed so many around him. When Soviet forces began their advance toward Auschwitz in January 1945, the SS conducted forced marches of prisoners westward, what history remembers as the Death Marches. These marches killed thousands of already weakened prisoners. Otto Frank was too ill to walk. He was left behind in the camp's infirmary when the SS evacuated, and on January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz and liberated the remaining prisoners. Otto Frank walked out of the gates of Auschwitz as a free man. He was one of approximately 6,000 surviving prisoners found at the camp at Liberation. He was emaciated, ill, and completely alone. He did not yet know whether Edith, Margot, or Anne had survived. The journey back to Amsterdam was long, circuitous, and emotionally agonizing. Otto travelled first through Soviet-controlled territory, making his way to Odessa on the Black Sea, then by ship to Marseille in southern France, and finally back north toward the Netherlands. During this journey, travelling by whatever transport was available in the chaotic weeks after liberation, he began making inquiries about his family. He arrived back in Amsterdam on June 3rd, 1945. Almost immediately, the weight of what had happened began to become clear. He learned that Edith had died. He learned that Margot and Anne had been transferred to Bergen-Belsen. For a brief period, he held on to hope that they might have survived. But word eventually reached him that both his daughters had died in Bergen-Belsen, likely in February or March of 1945, of typhus. The Red Cross officially confirmed their deaths in July 1945. The grief Otto Frank carried from that moment forward was immense and private. He had lost his wife of 20 years and both of his children. He had lost nearly his entire extended family. He had lost his world. And yet, what happened next was one of the most extraordinary acts of recovery and transformation in the entire history of the Second World War. His helper, Gies, came to him shortly after his return and placed in his hands the loose sheets of paper and the red and white checked diary that she had gathered from the floor of the annex after the arrest. She had kept them safe, unread, hoping to return them to Anne herself. Now she gave them to Otto. He began to read. What Otto discovered in those pages was a daughter he had known and yet, in some ways, had never fully known. Anne had written with a depth, intelligence, and emotional sophistication that astonished him. She had recorded not just the daily reality of hiding, the boredom and the fear and the tension and the small joys, but her own evolving inner life. Her doubts, her ambitions, her love of nature and writing, her complex feelings about her mother, her romantic awakening with Peter van Pels. Otto read the diary weeping. He later recalled that he had not known how much Anne had observed, how deeply she had thought, how clearly she had seen the world around her. Anne herself had harboured a dream of becoming a writer, and she had actually begun revising her diary entries with an eye toward publication, after hearing a Dutch government radio broadcast in March 1944 in which a minister called for ordinary citizens to preserve their wartime diaries and letters for the historical record. Anne took this seriously and began rewriting and editing her own entries. It was this revised version, along with the original diary, that formed the basis for what would eventually become one of the most read books in human history. But we will tell that story in full when we come to the diary's publication. For now, let us turn to the other members of the Frank family and trace their paths through the catastrophe of the Holocaust and beyond. Edith Frank née Hollander was born on January 16, 1900, in Aachen, Germany, the youngest of 4 children in a prosperous family. Her father, Abraham Hollander, ran a successful scrap metal business. Edith was raised in a traditionally Jewish household, considerably more observant in her faith than the more secular Frank family she would eventually marry into. She was educated and thoughtful, and by the time she met and married Otto Frank in 1925, she had developed into a quietly capable woman whose inner life was perhaps not always visible to those around her, including, as the diary would eventually reveal, her younger daughter. Anne's diary, famously, contains some sharp and sometimes painful observations about her mother. The teenage Anne found Edith overly critical, emotionally cool, and insufficiently understanding. The picture of Edith that emerges from the diary is complicated by the fact that it was written by an adolescent in the pressure cooker of extreme confinement, and historians and psychologists have been at pains to point out that Anne's portrait of her mother was inevitably partial and coloured by the tensions inherent in their situation. Edith, after all, was a woman in her early 40s who had lost her home, her freedom, her social world and much of her sense of the future, all while trying to maintain some semblance of stability for her family in an impossibly small space. When the Franks were arrested in August 1944 and transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, Edith and her daughters were processed into the women's camp at Birkenau. In late October 1944, Margot and Anne were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany, while Edith was kept behind at Birkenau. With her daughters gone, Edith Frank's will to survive appears to have collapsed. Surviving prisoners who knew her later described how she gave away her food rations so that others might survive. She stopped eating, stopped caring for herself, and gradually withdrew from the world. Edith Frank died at Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 6, 1945, less than 3 weeks before Soviet forces liberated the camp. She was 44 years old. She never knew that her husband had survived. She never knew what would become of her daughters. She never knew that her younger daughter's diary would one day be read by the entire world. The tragedy of Edith Frank is inseparable from the tragedy of the Holocaust itself, a woman of intelligence and warmth swallowed by an industrial system of murder. She has sometimes been overshadowed in accounts of the Frank family, partly because Anne's diary presents such a vivid and sometimes critical portrait of her, and partly because the story of the Franks has been told most often through Anne's voice. But Edith Frank deserves to be remembered in her own right, as a mother who did everything she could to protect her children, who brought them out of Germany early enough to give them years of relative safety, and who died alone in a concentration camp far from everyone she loved. Margot Betty Frank was the older of Otto and Edith's 2 daughters, born in Frankfurt on February 16, 1926. In Anne's diary, Margot appears as a somewhat idealized figure, conscientious, studious, obedient, and good-natured, a foil to Anne's more turbulent and self-questioning personality. Margot was everything a parent might hope for in a child of the 1930s and 40s. Diligent at school, polite, considerate, and serious. She was also deeply intelligent, and like Anne, she nurtured ambitions. Margot had expressed a wish to become a midwife or a nurse, and she was studying Hebrew with a view toward eventually emigrating to Palestine and building a life in the Jewish homeland. What is less well known about Margot is how central her deportation notice was to the entire story of the secret annex. It was the receipt of her call-up order on July 5, 1942, demanding that she report to a labor camp, that prompted Otto Frank to move the family into hiding one day earlier than originally planned. In a very real sense, it was the threat to Margot specifically that set the entire chain of events in motion. The family had been preparing the hiding place for months, but it was Margot's notice that made the situation suddenly and terrifyingly urgent. During the 2 years in the annex, Margot kept her own diary, though this document has never been found and is presumed lost. What survives of Margot's inner life comes almost entirely through Anne's references to her. The picture is of a young woman who bore the confinement with considerable grace, who read voraciously, who studied languages and corresponded with an American pen pal through a postbox arrangement, and who navigated the difficult emotional terrain of the annex, with more outward equanimity than her younger sister. When the Franks were arrested and deported in August 1944, Margot made the journey to Auschwitz-Birkenau alongside Anne and Edith. She and Anne were subsequently selected for transfer to Bergen-Belsen in late October 1944. Bergen-Belsen was, by late 1944 and early 1945, in a state of catastrophic collapse. The camp had been overwhelmed by tens of thousands of prisoners transferred from other camps as the German Empire contracted, and the administrative and physical infrastructure could not cope. Starvation, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases were rampant. Bodies piled up because there was neither the space nor the resources to bury them. Into this nightmare came Margot and Anne Frank, already weakened by their time at Auschwitz. Several survivors who were at Bergen-Belsen later gave testimony about seeing the Frank sisters there. One of the most poignant accounts came from Hannelie Goslar, Anne's childhood friend from Amsterdam, told Hannelie that she had nothing left, no resources, no food, no water, no shelter, no hope. She was utterly alone, cold and hungry, convinced that her parents were dead. Anne told Hannelie that she had nothing left, no clothes, no food, and no hope. Margot Frank died first. The exact date is uncertain, but historians believe it was sometime in late February or very early March 1945. She'd fallen from her bunk in a feverish delirium caused by typhus, and the fall either killed her outright or hastened her death by days. Anne, according to survivor accounts, died shortly after, most likely in early March 1945, of the same disease. She was 15 years old. The British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, just weeks after the Frank sisters died. Had they survived just a little longer, they would have been free. The cruelty of that near miss has haunted the telling of their story ever since. Margot Frank has, like her mother, sometimes lived in the shadow of her more famous younger sister. But she was a remarkable young woman in her own right, and the loss of her life at 19 years of age represents one of the innumerable individual tragedies that the aggregate horror of the Holocaust too often obscures. She had plans, ambitions, languages she was learning, a life she intended to live. All of it was taken from her by a regime that regarded her existence as a crime. And then there was Anne herself. Anneliese Marie Frank, born June 12, 1929 in Frankfurt am Main, who celebrated her 13th birthday on June 12, 1942, just 3 weeks before her family went into hiding, and who received as a birthday gift from her father a red and white checked autograph book that she immediately decided to use as a diary. That diary, and the girl who wrote it, need almost no introduction. But what is worth dwelling on in the context of this video is not just what Anne Frank experienced during her lifetime, but what happened to her legacy after her death, and how the words of a 15-year-old girl transformed the world's understanding of the Holocaust. Anne Frank died never knowing that anyone outside her immediate circle would ever read her words. She had hoped to publish them someday, had revised them with a writer's attention to craft and effect, had given names to all the people in her life, and invented pseudonyms for the published version. She had imagination and ambition enough to envision a future in which she was a published author. But in the mud and illness of Bergen-Belsen in the winter of 1945, that dream must have seemed impossibly remote. She died, as far as we know, without knowing the fate of her parents, without knowing that Otto had survived, and without any inkling of the extraordinary posthumous life her words would take on. What happened to Anne Frank after her death is, in one sense, the story of her father's extraordinary grief and determination. In another sense, it is the story of a document that found its moment in history with the precision of something almost prophetic. But that story belongs properly to the section of this video dealing with the diary's publication, Otto Frank's post-war life, and the creation of the Anne Frank house. Before we get there, we must follow the other people who shared those 761 days in the annex, because their fates, too, are part of the larger story of what happened to Anne Frank's world. Herman van Pels was born on March 31, 1898 in Gerde, a small town in Lower Saxony in northwestern Germany. He was a butcher and spice merchant by trade, and it was through the spice trade that he had come to know Otto Frank, eventually becoming a business partner and employee at Otto's Opekta and later Pecticon businesses in Amsterdam. Herman, his wife Augusta, and their teenage son Peter had been close to the Frank family socially for years before the war made that connection a matter of life and death. When Otto invited the Van Pels family to share the hiding place in the annex, it was an act rooted in genuine friendship and in practical necessity. Their business connection gave a credible reason for the Van Pelses to be associated with the Prinsengracht building. In Anne's diary, Herman van Pels, whom she called Herman van Pels but gave the pseudonym Herman van Pels in her revisions, appears as a somewhat difficult character. He was opinionated, argumentative, and prone to dominating conversations at the dinner table. He smoked heavily, which was a source of ongoing tension in the confined space of the annex, and he had periodic fierce arguments with his wife. But he was also capable of humour and warmth, and Anne's portrait of him is not without affection beneath the exasperation. He was, above all, a man under unimaginable pressure, watching his family's world contract to a few small rooms, while the world outside turned murderous. When the annex was raided on August 4, 1944, Herman van Pels was arrested along with the others and transported to Auschwitz. He is believed to have been gassed at Auschwitz in October or November of 1944, after being selected as unable to work during one of the camp's brutal selection processes. He was 46 years old. His death came without any of the documentation that might have pinned it to a specific date or place in the vast machinery of the camp. We know only what Otto Frank later recalled from conversations with fellow prisoners and from the general pattern of selections at Auschwitz in the autumn of 1944. August van Pels, born on September 29, 1900, in Buer, was in many ways Herman's opposite in temperament, while being his equal in stubbornness. Where Herman could be blunt and domineering, Auguste was theatrical, vain about her appearance by the standards of life in hiding, and given to dramatic complaints about the conditions of their concealment. Anne Frank's diary captures Auguste with a sharp eye, noting her tendency to hold forth on topics about which she had limited knowledge, her exaggerated concern for her physical comfort, and her complicated relationship with her husband. Anne called her August van Pels in her revised diary, using the pseudonym Petronella van Pels. But again, as with Edith, it is worth remembering that Anne was a teenager writing under extreme stress, and that Auguste van Pels was a woman watching everything she had ever known being dismantled around her. After the arrest in August 1944, Auguste survived Auschwitz and was subsequently transferred through several other concentration camps, including Belsen and Buchenwald. She was eventually transported to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. The exact date and place of her death are uncertain. Some accounts place her death at Theresienstadt in either April or May 1945. Tragically, if she died in May 1945, she may have been alive when the camp was liberated in early May 1945, dying in the chaos and disease that characterized the post-liberation period in the camps. She was, like Edith Frank, somewhere in her mid-40s when she died. A woman whose life had been dismantled piece by piece and who did not live to see any reconstruction. Peter van Pels was born on November 8, 1926, in Osnabrück, Germany. He was 16 years old when he moved into the annex with his parents in July 1942, a shy, somewhat introverted teenager who initially clashed with Anne, but who gradually became one of the most important emotional connections in her life during their time in hiding. In Anne's diary, her developing relationship with Peter is one of the most emotionally rich threads. She describes falling into a kind of first love with him, seeking him out in the small room under the eaves that was his private space in the annex, having long conversations, sharing their fears and dreams, and eventually their first kiss. It is one of the most tender and recognizable coming-of-age stories ever told, made heartbreaking by what we know of its ending. Peter van Pels survived the death march from Auschwitz that his fellow prisoner Otto Frank was too ill to undertake. He was among the prisoners marched westward when the SS evacuated Auschwitz ahead of the Soviet advance in January 1945. He ended up at Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, one of the harshest camps in the Nazi system, where prisoners were worked to death in stone quarries and subjected to brutal conditions. Peter van Pels died at Mauthausen on May 5, 1945. He was 18 years old. The camp was liberated by American forces on May 6, 1945, the day after his death. Like his idol Anne, he came within hours of survival, only to be taken at the very last moment. The timing is almost unbearable to contemplate. Fritz Pfeffer, the eighth and final resident of the secret annex, was a German-born dentist who joined the hiding group in November 1942. Anne Frank gave him the pseudonym Albert Dussel in her diary, a name that translates roughly as Albert Idiot, a reflection of her less than favourable impression of the man who was required to share her small room, and whose habits she found deeply irritating. In real life, Fritz Pfeffer was a more sympathetic figure than Anne's somewhat hostile portrait suggests. He was a 54-year-old man separated from his non-Jewish partner Charlotte Coletta, with whom he had been unable to marry under Nazi racial laws, and who was desperately worried about her safety as well as his own. His relationship with Anne was genuinely difficult, but the tensions in the annex were real and entirely understandable, given the impossible circumstances. After the arrest in August 1944, Pfeffer was transported first to the Westerbork transit camp and then to Auschwitz. He was subsequently transferred to the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, where he died on December 20th, 1944. He was 55 years old. His partner Charlotte Coletta survived the war. She spent years afterward working to restore his reputation against the unflattering portrait in Anne's diary. And she and her family remained involved in discussions about how Pfeffer should be remembered in the context of the Frank story for decades after the war ended. Charlotte Coletta died in 1985, having spent 40 years living with the complicated legacy of her wartime partner's posthumous fame, or rather his posthumous infamy in the public imagination shaped by a 15-year-old girl's diary. Before we move further into the story of the helpers and what happened to them after the war, it is worth taking a moment to trace the physical journey that the annex residents made from the moment of their arrest to their eventual fates. That journey passed through a specific infrastructure of Nazi persecution that tells its own story, and understanding it helps clarify both the experiences of the victims and the odds they faced. When the 8 residents of the secret annex were arrested on August 4th, 1944, they were first taken to the Uterpestraat, headquarters of the security service in Amsterdam. They were held there briefly and interrogated. They were then transferred to the Huis van Bewering, a Dutch house of detention, where they were held in a Dutch prison alongside other prisoners. From there, the 8 were transported to the Westerbork transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands, arriving around August 8, 1944. Westerbork was a camp established originally by the Dutch government before the war as a reception centre for Jewish refugees who had entered the Netherlands illegally, mostly German Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. With bitter irony, the Nazis took over this camp designed as a refuge and turned it into the principal transit point from which Dutch Jews were shipped east to the extermination camps. More than 100,000 Jews passed through Westerbork between 1942 and 1944. The Franks and their annex companions arrived toward the very end of the deportation period. They were for Jews who had been caught in hiding and transported to Westerbork. At Westerbork, the annex residents were housed in the punishment barracks, a designation reserved for Jews who had been caught in hiding and who were therefore considered to have broken the law. Conditions in the punishment barracks were harsh, but, by the standards of what was coming, still relatively livable. There were bunks, there was food of a kind, and there was at least the fresh air of the Dutch heath surrounding the camp. Several survivors who encountered the annex residents at Westerbork later recalled their impressions. Rosa de Winter, whom we mentioned earlier, saw Edith, Margot and Anne at the camp, and later reported that all 3 appeared physically well at that point but were clearly frightened about what lay ahead. Otto Frank worked in the metalworking shop at Westerbork, a detail that speaks to the camp's peculiar character as a transit point with pretensions of organisation and routine. Anne, by at least one account, seemed remarkably composed during the Westerbork period, as if the relief of no longer having to hide, no longer having to be silently invisible, had temporarily outweighed the terror of what came next. This observation has been made by more than one survivor witness and is psychologically interesting. The removal of the specific pressure of concealment may have briefly produced something resembling normality before the far greater horror of Auschwitz arrived. The transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz departed on September 3, 1944. It was the last transport of Jews from the Netherlands to Auschwitz. The cattle cars carried more than 1,000 people. The journey took 3 days. When the train arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on September 5, 1944, the selection process began immediately on the platform. Men were separated from women and children. Those deemed capable of work were sent into the camp. Those deemed unfit for work were sent directly to the gas chambers. Of the more than 1,000 people on that transport, approximately 500 were sent to the gas chambers within hours of arrival. The Frank family was separated on that platform. Otto went with the men. Edith, Margot and Anne went with the women. They never saw each other again. This moment of separation, the last time Otto saw his wife and daughters, was something Otto rarely described in detail. The pain of it was too fundamental. But it is the central rupture in the Frank family story, the moment when the family as a living unit ceased to exist, even though 3 of its 4 members were still alive. The rest of the story from that platform onward is the story of people moving separately toward very different ends. Now let us turn to the people without whom there would have been no secret annex, no diary, no survival even for Otto Frank. The helpers of Prinsengracht 263 are among the most celebrated figures to emerge from the story of the Holocaust, and rightfully so. They were ordinary Dutch men and women who chose at enormous personal risk and with full knowledge of what discovery would mean for them, to protect 8 people for more than 2 years. What happened to them after the war tells its own remarkable story of courage rewarded, trauma carried quietly, and lives transformed by a connection to one of the most famous documents in human history. Miep Gies was born Hermine Santruschitz on February 15, 1909 in Vienna, Austria. She had come to Amsterdam as a child in 1920, sent by her struggling Viennese family to be fostered by a Dutch family in a program designed to help malnourished Austrian children recover after the privations of the First World War. The fostering arrangement was meant to be temporary. It became permanent. Miep stayed in Amsterdam, became part of a Dutch family, learned the language, absorbed the culture, and eventually found work at Otto Frank's pectin business, where she became one of his most trusted office employees. She would later describe the Frank family as her own family, and that was no exaggeration of sentiment. She had known Anne and Margot since they were small girls. When Otto told Miep in the spring of 1942 that he intended to go into hiding with his family and needed her help, she did not hesitate. She later recalled that she felt it was simply the human thing to do. Her reaction has sometimes been held up as evidence of exceptional moral courage, which it undoubtedly was. But Miep herself always resisted this characterization. She didn't want to be called a hero. She felt that calling her a hero placed her on a pedestal that implicitly excused everyone else who had not done what she did, as if only heroes could be expected to act decently. She wanted people to understand that she was an ordinary woman who made a choice, and that ordinary people were capable of making that same choice. During the 2 years and 1 month of hiding, Miep Gies was the most important single lifeline for the 8 people in the annex. She came to the building every day, she brought food, she brought news from the outside world, she brought comfort. She navigated the black market to supplement the rationed food supplies. She managed the endless logistical challenges of keeping 8 people fed and informed without arousing suspicion. And she did all of this while continuing to run the business on the floors below as if nothing unusual was happening. Her husband, Jan Gies, was also involved in the effort and provided crucial additional support, including contacts with the Dutch resistance who helped supply food coupons. Jan Gies was born on July 18, 1905, in Amsterdam, and worked as a social worker with the Amsterdam municipality. His work, which placed him in contact with the Dutch civil service, gave him access to resources and contacts that proved invaluable in supporting the hiding operation. Jan Gies was deeply committed to the Dutch resistance more broadly, not just to the specific cause of hiding the Franks. He risked his life repeatedly in both capacities. He and Miep married on July 16, 1941, with Otto Frank acting as a witness at their wedding. Their personal relationship with the Franks was thus embedded in one of the most significant friendships in the entire story. After the arrest of the annex residents on August 4, 1944, it was Miep who went back into the annex the following day and gathered up the scattered pages of Anne's diary from the floor, where the German officers had apparently strewn them while searching for valuables. She took the pages, along with Anne's red and white check diary and a second notebook, and locked them in her desk drawer. She did not read them. She told herself she was saving them for Anne. For months, as the war dragged on and the news from the camps grew darker, she kept faith with that intention. And then, after the liberation and after Otto's return and after the shattering news that Anne and Margot and Edith had not survived, she placed the papers in Otto's hands. That act, the choice to gather those pages and keep them safe and unread, was perhaps the most consequential single act of the entire story. After the war, Mape and Jan Gies continued living in Amsterdam. Jan died on January 26, 1993. Mape lived on for another 17 years, becoming in the later decades of her life one of the most important living witnesses to Anne Frank's story. She gave interviews, visited schools, spoke at commemorations, and in 1987 published her memoir, Anne Frank Remembered, which became an international bestseller and provided an invaluable account of the hiding period from the perspective of someone who had been on the other side of the bookcase. She received numerous honours, including the Dutch Resistance Memorial Cross, the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Yad Vashem Righteous Among the Nations designation, the Israeli state's highest honour for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Mape Gies died on January 11, 2010, at the remarkable age of 100 years old, in Hoorn, Netherlands. She had outlived almost everyone connected to the story. In her final years, she was clear that she felt grateful above all that the diary had found its way into the world. She had lived long enough to see it translated into dozens of languages, to see the Anne Frank house become one of the most visited museums in Europe, to see the name of the girl she had known and loved become synonymous around the world with the human cost of hatred and indifference. She once said, in the characteristic simplicity that marked everything she said about those years, that she was glad she had been there to save what could be saved. Johannes Kleiman was born on August 17, 1896, and had been one of Otto Frank's earliest and most trusted business colleagues in Amsterdam. He was an accountant who managed the financial side of the business and who knew about the hiding plan from the very beginning. Kleiman was a quiet, dependable, deeply decent man whose role in the hiding operation was less visible than Miep's, but no less essential. He managed the business affairs, coordinated with suppliers, dealt with any official visitors to the building, and maintained the fiction of normal commercial activity that kept the building from arousing suspicion. He did this despite suffering from chronic stomach complaints that periodically incapacitated him during the hiding period and beyond. When the security police arrived on August 4, 1944, Kleiman was arrested along with Victor Kugler and taken to the Amstelveen-Schouwweg prison. He was later transferred to the Amersfoort concentration camp. In September 1944, Kleiman was released on medical grounds, his chronic stomach condition having deteriorated to the point where his captors apparently deemed continued imprisonment more trouble than it was worth. He returned to Amsterdam and resumed his role at Otto Frank's company. After the war, he continued working for what became known as the Otto Frank Company until his retirement, and he remained in close contact with Otto throughout the rest of his life. Johannes Kleiman died on January 28, 1959 in Amsterdam, of a stroke that struck him while he was at his desk, in the very building where he had helped hide 8 people for 2 years. He was 62 years old. He too received the Yad Vashem Righteous Among the Nations designation, as did all the principal helpers. Victor Kugler, known in Anne's diary as Mr. Krahler, was born on June 5, 1900, in Hohenelbe, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the territory that would later become part of Czechoslovakia. He had come to the Netherlands after the First World War and joined Otto Frank's company in the 1930s, rising to the position of business partner and company director. It was Kugler who took the most direct role in the day-to-day management of the business during the hiding period, presenting a face of normality to customers, suppliers, and any official visitors, while managing the delicate logistics of a building that simultaneously needed to appear as a functioning commercial enterprise while concealing 8 people in its back rooms. Kugler was arrested alongside Kleiman on August 4, 1944, and taken first to prison and then to a labour camp in Zwolle. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced, he was being marched to Germany with other prisoners when he managed to escape. He made his way back to Amsterdam and resumed his life. But unlike Kleiman, who remained in the Netherlands until his death, Kugler eventually decided to emigrate. The war, and perhaps the weight of the memories associated with Amsterdam, made the city feel impossible. In 1955, he moved to Canada, eventually settling in Toronto, where he lived out the remainder of his life working for a time in the printing industry. He gave occasional talks about his experiences and remained in contact with Otto Frank until Otto's death. Victor Kugler died in Toronto on December 14, 1981. He was 81 years old, a man who had risked everything to do right by his friends and colleagues, and who had spent the rest of his life carrying that experience with him across an ocean. Bep Voskuil, whose real name was Elizabeth Voskuil and whom Anne called Ellie Vossen in the revised diary, was born on July 5, 1919, making her the youngest of the helpers. She was 23 years old when the Franks went into hiding, a secretary in the office who had known the Frank family since the early days of the company. Bep was in many ways the most emotionally complex of the helpers. She was deeply devoted to the Franks, but she was also young and frightened, and the 2 years of hiding took a severe psychological toll on her. Anne's diary captures Bep with affection, describing her warmth and her kindness and her willingness to do whatever was needed, but also her anxiety and occasional emotional fragility. What is less widely known is that Bep's father, Johan Voskuil, worked as a warehouse manager at the Prinsengracht building and was also deeply involved in supporting the hidden people, helping to maintain the building's systems and keeping the lower floors functioning smoothly. He too knew about the annex and kept the secret. Johan Voskuil developed serious illness during the hiding period, stomach cancer, and died in November 1945, not long after the war's end, without having seen justice done for what had happened to the Frank family. Bep Voskuil survived the war and remained in the Netherlands. She married the accountant Cornelis van Wyk in 1946 and went on to have 4 children. She lived a relatively quiet life, rarely speaking publicly about her wartime experiences, and at times finding the attention that came with being associated with the Anne Frank story difficult to bear. She gave a few interviews over the years, but was notably more reticent than Mep Gies. Part of this reticence may have been related to her own emotional processing of the trauma. She was also, according to family members, troubled throughout her life by a particular anxiety. She had at times wondered whether her own brother, Nelly Voskuil's romantic relationship with a German soldier, could have indirectly contributed in some way to the betrayal of the annex, though no evidence has ever established any such connection. Bep Voskuil died on May 6, 1983 in Utrecht. She was 63 years old. In her later years, she had begun to open up more about her wartime experiences, and she had been working with her son, Joop, to document her memories. Her story was eventually told in more detail by her son in the book The Last Secret of the Secret Annex, published in Dutch in 2015 and subsequently translated, in which Joop van Wyk put forward a theory about the betrayal of the annex that pointed toward a different suspect than most previous investigators had considered. We will return to the betrayal mystery shortly. Now, let us consider a man whose role in the Frank story has sometimes been overlooked, but who played an absolutely critical role in bringing Anne's diary to the world. This was Otto Frank's business colleague and friend Jan Roman, but more directly it was a pair of Dutch journalists who first read the diary and recognized its significance. Actually, let us begin properly with Otto Frank himself in his post-war years, because his story after the war is one of the most remarkable tales of transformation through grief in the 20th century. And it is deeply intertwined with the question of how Anne's diary came to exist as the document we know today. When Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam in June 1945, he moved in with Miep and Jan Gies in their apartment on Hunzestraat. He had no home, no family, and no clear sense of what the rest of his life was meant to look like. He was 56 years old. He had survived the Holocaust. He was the only member of his immediate family to do so. He was surrounded by the ruins of a world he had built over 2 decades in Amsterdam. He was also, as the weeks and months passed, increasingly absorbed in the diary. Otto began reading Anne's diary in the summer of 1945. He translated passages from Dutch into German for his mother, Alice Frank Stern, who was living in Basel, Switzerland, and who needed the translation to access her granddaughter's words. He began showing the diary to friends and colleagues. People who read it were uniformly astonished. The Amsterdam historian Jan Roman read the diary at a friend's suggestion and was so moved that in April 1946 he published an article about it in the Dutch newspaper Het Parool. The article was titled A Child's Voice, and it described the diary as a document of exceptional human and historical significance. The response to Romain's article was significant. Publishers began approaching Otto Frank about the possibility of publication. Otto was initially hesitant. Anne had written privately. Some of her observations were sharp and personal. Some of the material about her developing sexuality, her thoughts about her own body, Her early romantic feelings was deeply intimate. Otto edited the diary before publication, removing some passages he felt were too personal or too hurtful to living individuals, and combining material from both Anne's original diary and her revised version. He has been criticised for these editorial decisions by some scholars who feel that the published version obscures aspects of Anne's personality and inner life. More complete versions of the diary have since been published, but Otto Frank's first priority was to honour his daughter's wish to be published while protecting the privacy of people who were still alive and ensuring the text was accessible to a broad readership. The diary was first published in the Netherlands in June 1947 under the title Het Achterhuis, which translates as The Secret Annex or The Back House. The initial print run was small and the response cautious. But word spread. The book was reprinted. It found readers not just in the Netherlands but increasingly across Europe. German publishers eventually approached Otto with interest, a development that filled him with complicated feelings, given that Germany was the country whose ideology had murdered his family. He agreed to German publication in 1950, recognizing that reaching German readers was precisely the kind of reckoning that the book needed to provoke. The German edition sold exceptionally well. The English-language edition appeared in the United States in 1952, published by Doubleday under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, with an introduction by the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt that helped bring it to an enormous American audience. It became a bestseller. In 1955, a stage adaptation by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett opened on Broadway, ran for more than 700 performances, and won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. A film adaptation followed in 1959. Suddenly, Anne Frank was not just a book read by those interested in the history of the Holocaust. She was a cultural phenomenon, her story translated into more than 70 languages. Her diary in print in over 30 million copies, her name recognized in every corner of the world. Otto Frank navigated all of this with extraordinary care and, by most accounts, with a clear and consistent sense of purpose. He saw the diary not primarily as a monument to Anne's memory, but as an instrument for education, for tolerance, for the prevention of the kind of hatred that had killed his daughter. He responded personally to thousands of letters sent to him by readers around the world, especially young readers who wrote to him in their thousands from every country. He corresponded with school children in Japan, in the United States, in Brazil, in Israel. He answered questions about Anne with patience and warmth. He didn't present himself as a victim. He presented himself as a witness, and he used every platform available to him to carry a message about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of human dignity. It was in Basel, Switzerland, that Otto Frank settled permanently after the war. He had initially remained in Amsterdam for several years, but in 1952 he moved to Basel, where his sister Helene Elias and his mother Alice were living. That same year he married Elfriede Geiringer, known as Fritzi, a Holocaust survivor herself who had been Edith Frank's close friend in Auschwitz's final days. Fritzi had survived Auschwitz along with her daughter Eva. Her son Heinz had died at the Mauthausen camp, the same camp where Peter van Pels had died. Fritzi and Otto had both lost spouses and children. They found in each other a kind of understanding that only those who had been through the same absolute devastation could provide. Their marriage, by all accounts, was deeply loving and supportive. Otto later said that Fritzi had given him back the capacity to live. In Basel, Otto Frank continued to run the Anne Frank Fonds, the foundation he established in 1963 to manage the rights to Anne's diary and to use the proceeds for charitable and educational purposes. He worked tirelessly on the diary's translation and distribution, on the establishment of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, and on the broader project of Holocaust education. He received honours from governments around the world, gave interviews to journalists and historians, and spent considerable time and emotional energy dealing with a constant stream of Holocaust deniers, diary skeptics, and people who wrote to him insisting that the diary was a forgery. He bore this particular burden with remarkable patience, cooperating fully with any legitimate scholarly investigation and pursuing legal action against those who made denial claims publicly. Otto Frank died on August 19, 1980, in Beiersfelden, near Basel, Switzerland. He was 91 years old. He had survived Auschwitz, outlived his captors, seen his daughter's diary become one of the most influential books in human history, and spent 35 years after the war as the world's most devoted guardian of his daughter's legacy. He had also, by his own account, spent those years gradually coming to understand a daughter he had not fully known during her lifetime. The diary had given him Anne back, in a way, and it had given him a mission. He used both gifts with everything he had. His wife Fritzi Frank survived him, dying on October 11, 1998 in London, where she had moved in her later years to be close to her daughter Ava. She too had spent decades as a witness and educator, carrying the story of her own survival alongside the story of the Franks. Her death at the age of 84 marked the passing of one of the last direct personal connections to the world that the diary described. Let us also trace more carefully the post-war trajectory of Otto Frank's business and the fate of the Prinsengracht building in the immediate post-war years, because this timeline helps explain how the Anne Frank house came to be and what Otto had to navigate before the diary became the global phenomenon it eventually was. When Otto returned to Amsterdam in June 1945, he found the business at Prinsengracht in a complicated state. His colleagues Kleiman and Kugler had done their best to keep the company operating during the occupation, but the business had been declared an enemy enterprise by the Nazi administration and had been subject to administrative complications. The stocks and assets had been partially depleted. Rebuilding would take time and effort that Otto could barely muster in the immediate aftermath of his losses. Nevertheless, Otto threw himself into the reconstruction of his life with characteristic determination. He resumed a role in the company, worked with Kleiman to restore its operations, and spent the years from 1945 to 1952 in Amsterdam before his move to Basel. During this period, he was simultaneously managing the business, coping with the psychological weight of his losses, processing the diary and moving toward its publication, and engaging with the growing circle of people who had read the diary or heard about it and wanted to discuss it with him. The Dutch publication of the diary in 1947 produced a response that Otto had not fully anticipated. The book found a devoted audience in the Netherlands where the experience of occupation was fresh and the memory of the deportations was raw. Dutch readers recognised the world Anne described because it was their world too, the Amsterdam of wartime, the fear and the hiding and the deportations that had emptied so many neighbourhoods of their Jewish inhabitants. For Dutch readers, the diary was simultaneously a document of their own recent history and a devastating reminder of what that history had meant for the people who had been murdered. The German publication of 1950 was more fraught. West Germany in 1950 was a country still in the early stages of confronting what it had done. The Nuremberg trials had established the legal framework for accountability at the highest levels, but ordinary German society was still in a period of collective denial, trauma, and attempted normalization. Many Germans had participated in or been complicit in Nazi crimes and were not eager to examine that participation. The publication of a book by a murdered Jewish girl from a German Jewish family was, for some German readers, profoundly uncomfortable. For others, it was exactly the kind of document they needed to encounter. Anne Frank's diary became one of the vehicles through which German society in the 1950s and 1960s began the long and painful process of confronting the Holocaust. The stage adaptation was produced in Germany and provoked powerful reactions. Audiences wept, some walked out. Discussions about guilt and responsibility and complicity erupted in German newspapers and in German homes in ways that had not been possible in the immediate post-war years. Historians of German memory have noted that the Anne Frank story played a distinctive role in the development of German Holocaust consciousness, serving as a point of emotional entry that made the abstract horror of the statistics personal and comprehensible. This process was not without its contradictions. Some critics argued that the universalizing tendency of the Anne Frank story, its tendency to be framed as a story about a human being rather than specifically about a Jewish victim of specifically anti-Semitic persecution, allowed German audiences to empathize without fully confronting the specific nature of the crime. The question of whether the diary's impact has been to deepen or to simplify German engagement with the Holocaust has been debated by German historians and educators for decades. It is not a question with a simple answer. Both things are probably true. The diary has opened doors for many people, while also sometimes allowing others to feel that they have engaged with the Holocaust when they have only touched its edge. The American story of the diary's reception is also worth examining in some detail. When the English-language edition appeared in 1952 and the Broadway play opened in 1955, the United States was a country in the early years of the Cold War, deeply invested in a narrative of its own moral righteousness and democratic virtue. The Holocaust, in this context, was often framed as something that had happened in Europe, as a product of European fascism and European anti-Semitism, as an aberration from human decency that America had helped to defeat. The specifically American Jewish community, many of whose members had lost relatives in the Holocaust, was still in the early stages of processing its collective grief and finding its public voice. The Broadway play, which emphasized the universal human dimension of Anne Frank's story and concluded with her voice declaring her belief that people were fundamentally good, struck a deep chord in American audiences precisely because it offered a version of the Holocaust story that affirmed rather than challenged American values. This has been the source of significant critical attention, most famously from the scholar Cynthia Ozick, who wrote a landmark essay arguing that the Broadway version of Anne Frank had been sentimentalized and universalized to the point of distortion, and that the specifically Jewish dimension of the story had been deliberately minimized to make it palatable to a broader, non-Jewish American audience. Ozick's critique was itself controversial, but it opened a debate about the cultural uses of the Anne Frank story that has continued to this day. Otto Frank was aware of these criticisms and had complicated feelings about them. He wanted the diary to reach the broadest possible audience, and he understood that reaching a broad audience sometimes required presenting the story in terms that were accessible to people who did not share its specific cultural background. At the same time, he was clear that Anne's Jewishness was central to her story and to the reason she was murdered, and he resisted attempts to obscure that fact. The tension between universal accessibility and specific Jewish identity is one that runs through the entire history of how the Anne Frank story has been told and used, and it has not been resolved. Now let us turn to a part of the Anne Frank story that receives far less attention than it deserves: the extended Frank family. The aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents who were part of Anne's world before and during the war, and whose own stories of survival, loss, and post-war life form an essential part of the larger picture. Alice Betty Frank Stern was born on March 20th, 1865 in Landau in the Palatinate, Germany. She was Otto, Frank's mother, Anne and Margot's grandmother. During Anne's childhood in Frankfurt, Alice was a central figure in the family's life, and Anne's diary makes several affectionate references to her grandmother, who had died in early 1942 in Basel, Switzerland, before the family went into hiding. Actually, let us correct the timeline. Alice Frank Stern emigrated to Basel, Switzerland to live with her daughter Helene after conditions for Jews in Germany became intolerable in the 1930s. She survived the war in the relative safety of Switzerland. She was the matriarch of the Frank family, and after the war, when Otto began translating Anne's diary for his mother's benefit, Alice became one of the first people outside the immediate circle to read and understand the significance of what Anne had written. Alice Frank Stern died on March 20th, 1953, on her 88th birthday in Basel. She had outlived two of her sons, Herbert, and later she witnessed Robert's survival, and she had lived long enough to see her granddaughter's diary published and beginning to reach the world. The grief she carried for the grandchildren she had lost, Margot and Anne, and the other family members swallowed by the Holocaust, was something she shared with Otto in the letters they exchanged throughout the post-war years. Her survival in Switzerland, in the refuge that Helene and Erich Elias had established there, was one of the few genuinely fortunate outcomes in the Frank family story. Helene Frank Elias, known to family and friends as Leni, was Otto Frank's younger sister, born on February 20th, 1893 in Frankfurt. She had married Erich Elias in 1921, and the couple had moved to Basel in the 1930s as the situation for Jews in Germany deteriorated. Erich Elias had been a business partner of Otto's in the early years, and it was through Erich's Swiss business contacts that Otto had been able to establish his Amsterdam operations in the first place. Leni and Erich were thus not just Otto's family, but the foundation on which the Amsterdam chapter of the Frank story rested. Erich Elias died in 1950. Leni survived him by more than 2 decades, living in Basel and remaining in close contact with Otto throughout her life. She was one of the people to whom Otto confided most deeply about the process of editing and publishing the diary, and she provided family perspective that helped shape the published text. Leni Frank Elias died on February 16, 1986, in Basel. She was 92 years old, one of the longer-lived members of the Frank family, and she had spent her entire post-war adult life in close proximity to the story of her niece's diary and its global impact. The Elias sons, Leni and Eric's children, were Anne's first cousins and among her closest family connections outside the immediate household. Stefan Elias, the elder son, born in 1921, served in the British Army during the war as he had British citizenship through his Swiss-born father's business connections. He was thus fighting on the Allied side while his aunt's family hid in Amsterdam. After the war, Stefan settled in England. He died relatively young in 1980, having maintained his connection to the Frank family story throughout his adult life. Buddy Elias, however, is the name that stands out in any account of the Frank family after the war. Born on May 24, 1925 in Frankfurt, Buddy Elias was Anne's closest cousin and, in her childhood, perhaps her closest friend outside the immediate family. Anne's letters to Buddy, written before the family went into hiding, are full of warmth and the easy intimacy of children who have grown up together as almost siblings. Buddy moved to Basel with his family in the 1930s and pursued a career as an ice skater and actor, performing in touring ice shows and eventually settling in Basel, where he became involved in theatre. He is reported to have been a charming and gregarious man, full of the energy and sociability that characterized the Frank family at its best. After Otto Frank died in 1980, it was Buddy Elias who became the president of the Anne Frank Fonds, the foundation Otto had established to manage the diary's rights and to use its proceeds for educational purposes. Buddy took on this responsibility with evident dedication, becoming a public face for the Frank family legacy in the final decades of the 20th century and into the 21st. He gave interviews, participated in commemorations, and continued the work of Holocaust education that Otto had made central to the family's mission. He was, in a very real sense, the last living person who had known Anne Frank as a child, as a cousin, as a playful girl in the years before the war had consumed everything. Buddy Elias died on June 15, 2015, in Basel. He was 89 years old. His death marked the end of a direct personal connection to Anne Frank that stretched back to their shared childhood in Frankfurt in the early 1930s. Eva Schloss, Fritzi. Geiringer's daughter, and thus Otto Frank's stepdaughter, continued to represent the family's living link to that era after Buddy's death, and she remains active as of this writing as a speaker and Holocaust educator. But, with Buddy Elias gone, the last person who had sat in the same room as Anne Frank as an equal, as a playmate and cousin, rather than a witness or guardian, was no longer alive to speak of her. Robert Frank, Otto's older brother, was born in 1886 in Frankfurt and had a somewhat different trajectory from the rest of the family. Robert had emigrated to England in the 1930s, recognising the danger to German Jews earlier than some, and established himself in London, where he worked in finance. He survived the war in England and remained there for the rest of his life. Robert Frank died in 1953. His survival, like his mother Alice's survival and the survival of Leni and Eric in Switzerland, represents one of the threads of continuity that kept the Frank family alive and connected even as the Holocaust destroyed so much of the broader Jewish community of Frankfurt and Amsterdam. Herbert Frank, Otto's brother born in 1891, had a far darker fate. Herbert had remained in Germany longer than the others and had struggled to find viable options for emigration as the Nazi grip tightened. He died in 1945, having survived in occupied Europe under conditions that remain somewhat unclear, but that clearly involved the deprivations and dangers of the wartime period for a Jewish man attempting to survive in Nazi-controlled territory. The details of Herbert's fate are less well documented than those of the more famous Frank family members, but his loss was one of the many griefs that Otto carried. Now let us turn to one of the most haunting and unresolved questions in the entire Frank story. Who betrayed the secret annex? On August 4, 1944, a Dutch detective sergeant named Abraham Kapper arrived at Prinsengracht 263 with several members of the German security police. They went directly to the bookcase that concealed the entrance to the annex, pulled it aside, and arrested everyone inside. Someone had told them exactly where to look. The identity of that person, or persons, has been debated and investigated for more than 70 years. The question is not merely historical. It cuts to the heart of how we understand culpability and complicity under occupation, and it involves real people and their descendants in ways that have produced extraordinary controversy. The first person seriously investigated as the potential betrayer was Willem Gerard van Maren, the warehouse manager who had replaced Johan Voskuil when Voskuil became ill in 1943. Van Maren was a suspicious figure. He had noticed things in the warehouse that suggested the building was not as empty as it was supposed to be at night, and he had apparently asked questions that made the helpers nervous. The Dutch State Criminal Investigation Department conducted 2 post-war investigations into Van Maren in 1948 and again in 1963. Neither investigation produced sufficient evidence to charge him, and the case was closed in 1964. Van Maren denied any involvement until his death in 1971. For decades, the investigations stalled, but interest in the question never faded, and in the early 21st century, a new effort to solve the mystery was mounted. The Anne Frank House commissioned a team of investigators, led by retired FBI agent Vince Pankoke, to use modern investigative methods, including artificial intelligence tools to analyze historical documents, to take a fresh look at the evidence. The team worked for several years and published its conclusions in 2022 in a book titled The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a cold case investigation. The team's primary conclusion was startling. They suggested that the most likely betrayer was a Jewish notary named Arnold van den Berg, who was alleged to have been a member of the Amsterdam Jewish Council and to have passed addresses of hidden Jews to the Nazi authorities in exchange for protection for his own family. The theory was not new. It had appeared in anonymous notes sent to Otto Frank shortly after the war, and Otto had investigated and then set aside without pursuing publicly. The 2022 investigation brought it back into the spotlight with considerable force. The reaction to the book was fierce and divided. Some historians accepted the team's methodology and found the Van den Berg theory plausible and well supported. Others were sharply critical, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the use of artificial intelligence to analyze historical documents had not been as rigorous as claimed, and that publishing an accusation against a Jewish victim of the Holocaust without conclusive proof risked causing harm to his descendants and to historical understanding. The Netherlands Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies issued a pointed critique shortly after the book's publication, arguing that the investigation's methods were flawed and that its conclusions were not supported by the evidence. The controversy has not been resolved. The identity of the betrayer of the secret annex remains officially unknown. What is certain is that someone made a deliberate choice to inform on 8 people in hiding, and that this choice sent those 8 people into the machinery of the Holocaust with consequences we have already traced. Whether it was a Dutch collaborator acting out of self-interest, an opportunist seeking a reward, or a Jewish victim of the Nazi system trying desperately to protect his own family, the moral weight of that choice and its consequences is impossible to calculate. The question of the betrayal sits at the heart of the larger question about how ordinary human beings behave under extreme oppression, and it resists the simple moral categories that the rest of the Frank story sometimes seems to invite. Eva Schloss, born Eva Geiringer on May 11, 1929 in Vienna, is one of the most important living connections to the Anne Frank story. Eva and Anne had been close childhood friends in Amsterdam, neighbours on the Merwedeplein before the war, and Eva has spent much of her adult life as a Holocaust educator and advocate for tolerance and reconciliation. Eva and her mother Fritzi survived Auschwitz together, while Eva's brother Heinz and her father Erich Geiringer did not survive. When Fritzi and Otto Frank married in 1952, Eva became in effect Otto's stepdaughter, a connection that gave her both a personal stake in the Frank legacy and a platform from which to speak about it. Eva Schloss has given hundreds of talks, written her memoirs, and collaborated on educational projects around the world. She has been particularly active in speaking to young people about Anne Frank and about the Holocaust, drawing on her personal friendship with Anne as a way of making the story immediate and human. She has also been willing to speak of this writing, one of the most prominent of this writing, one of the most prominent surviving voices connected to the Frank world. The Anne Frank house in Amsterdam deserves its own detailed consideration because it is not simply a museum. It is one of the most visited memorial sites in Europe, receiving more than 1 million visitors per year in normal years. And it represents an extraordinary act of preservation and commemoration that has shaped how the world understands the Holocaust for more than 60 years. The building at Prinsengracht 263 was saved from demolition in the 1950s by a group of Amsterdam citizens who recognized its historical significance. The threat of demolition was real, and the campaign to save the building required considerable public mobilization. Otto Frank was deeply involved in the effort to preserve the building, though he rarely visited the house itself after the war. He found it too painful. The Anne Frank house opened as a museum on May 3, 1960, with the preserved rooms of the secret annex at its heart. Otto gave a speech at the opening ceremony, one of the few times he was present in the physical space where his daughter had hidden. The museum has expanded over the decades, adding modern exhibition spaces and educational facilities, while preserving the core of the annex and the commercial premises below. The bookcase that concealed the annex entrance is still there, standing exactly as it stood in 1942, when it was first installed. The rooms of the annex are stripped of furniture at Otto Frank's request to preserve a sense of emptiness that speaks more powerfully than any reconstruction could. The pencil marks on the doorframe of the annex where Otto measured his daughter's heights are still visible. These physical details have moved millions of visitors to tears. The building's preservation and the museum's operation is managed by the Anne Frank House Foundation, a separate organisation from the Anne Frank Fonds that Otto established in Basel. The relationship between the two organisations has sometimes been complicated by questions of authority and interpretation, but their shared commitment to the legacy of Anne Frank's diary has kept both institutions functioning and effective for decades. The Anne Frank House has an educational programme that reaches schools across the Netherlands and beyond, and it has developed materials in multiple languages for use by teachers around the world. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Anne Frank house and about the broader cultural phenomenon that Anne Frank's diary has become is the sheer range of people it has reached and the remarkable diversity of the responses it has provoked. The diary has been praised by world leaders and school children alike. It has been the subject of academic conferences and the source of personal transformation for individuals who credit it with changing the course of their lives. Nelson Mandela, who read it during his imprisonment on Robben Island, spoke of its impact with profound feeling. Millions of Japanese schoolchildren have read it as part of their curriculum, making Japan one of the countries where the diary has been most deeply absorbed into the culture. In the United States, it has been one of the most widely read books in school curricula for more than 50 years, though it has also been the target of book banning campaigns in various school districts, a painful irony given the subject matter. The story of the diary is not, however, without its controversies. Almost from the time of its publication, a small but persistent movement of Holocaust deniers and anti-Semitic agitators claimed that the diary was a forgery, either the work of Otto Frank himself or of a professional ghostwriter. These claims were patently false and were systematically disproved by scientific investigations of the handwriting, paper, and ink used in the diary, which confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that the diary was authentic and that the handwriting was that of a single person who changed as the writer aged. The Netherlands State Institute for War Documentation published an exhaustive critical edition of the diary in 1986 that definitively established its authenticity. Despite this, denial claims have periodically resurfaced, and Otto Frank spent significant resources pursuing legal action against those who made them during his lifetime. The question of what the diary means and what it should be used to teach has also generated continuing debate. Some scholars and Holocaust educators have argued that the diary's enormous popularity has paradoxically distorted public understanding of the Holocaust by focusing attention on a single individual survivor and presenting her story in an ultimately hopeful frame that obscures the fact that most victims left no record and experienced no redemption. The famous line attributed to Anne Frank that she still believed, in spite of everything, that people were really good at heart has been the subject of particularly pointed debate. Critics have noted that this line, taken from a diary entry written well before the denouement of the story, has been used to impose a positive and redemptive reading on an event that offers very little genuine redemption. Anne Frank did not survive to maintain or abandon that belief. She died at 15 in circumstances of extreme misery. The question of what we take from her story is thus a genuinely serious one, and it has been seriously debated. Otto Frank himself was sensitive to this criticism. He was consistent in his view that the diary should be used to educate about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of tolerance, but he was equally clear that it was a document of historical suffering and not simply an inspirational text. He resisted attempts to depoliticize the diary or to divorce it from its specific historical context as a record of Jewish persecution by a specifically Nazi state, and he was careful, in his decades of public engagement with readers and students, to ensure that Anne's story was understood as one story among 6 million, each of equal weight and tragedy, even if her particular story had found a unique way to reach the world's consciousness. The legal and copyright history of the diary has also been complex and occasionally contentious. The rights to the diary are held by the Anne Frank Fonds in Basel, which has used the revenues from the work for charitable and educational purposes. Questions about the extension of copyright, the status of new editions, and the rights of scholars to publish complete versions of the text have periodically generated legal controversy. In 2015, the Anne Frank Fonds made a controversial decision to add Otto Frank as a co-author of the diary in certain versions, a move intended to extend the copyright term under Dutch and European law. The decision was widely criticized by scholars and by Holocaust educators who felt it was legally questionable and ethically dubious to claim co-authorship of a document that was fundamentally Anne Frank's alone. These controversies, as much as the universal reverence, are part of the living history of Anne Frank's legacy. They reflect the continuing effort of different people and institutions to understand, protect, and transmit a document that has become far larger than any single owner or guardian. They are, in their own way, evidence of the diary's vitality, because only a document that still matters generates arguments about how it should be used. The Anne Frank story also has a significant and sometimes overlooked dimension in Israel and in the broader Jewish world. For many survivors who emigrated to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, and later the State of Israel, the Holocaust was initially something that the new Israeli society wanted to move beyond, rather than dwell on. The founding ethos of Zionism in the post-war period emphasized the creation of a new kind of Jew, a fighter and builder rather than a victim, and there was in some quarters a sense that dwelling on the victimhood of European Jews was antithetical to this project. The diary, with its setting in hiding, and its protagonist who wrote in a secret room rather than fighting back, was not universally embraced in early Israeli culture. This changed significantly over time, particularly after the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, which brought the full horror of the Holocaust before the Israeli public in an intensive and unavoidable way. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who had been one of the principal logistical organizers of the deportation of Jews to the extermination camps, had been captured in Argentina by Israeli Mossad agents in 1960 and brought to Israel for trial. The trial was the first major public reckoning with the Holocaust in Israel, and it produced a seismic shift in Israeli consciousness about the war years. After the Eichmann trial, the Holocaust became a central element of Israeli national identity and memory, and the Anne Frank diary took on a new significance as one of the most widely accessible personal testimonies from that era. Israel declared a National Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, which is observed each year with ceremonies across the country. The Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem, established in 1953, became the central institution of Israeli Holocaust memory, collecting testimonies, documents, and artifacts from the entire range of the Holocaust experience and recognizing, through its Righteous Among the Nations program, the non-Jewish individuals who had risked their lives to save Jews. The helpers of the secret annex, Miep Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, Jan Gies, and Bep Voskuil, all received the Righteous Among the Nations designation from Yad Vashem, an honor that meant enormous personal significance to each of them. The way Anne Frank's story has been taught in Israel is also interesting in its differences from the American or European approaches. Israeli Holocaust education tends to place Anne Frank in a more explicitly historical and specifically Jewish context, one that emphasizes not just the personal tragedy, but the systematic nature of the persecution, the specific ideology of anti-Semitism that drove it, and the implications for Jewish identity and the necessity of a Jewish state. The universalizing framing that has characterized some American and European uses of the diary has generally been less dominant in Israeli Holocaust education. Let us also consider the fate of the broader Van Pels family connections, which have received less attention than the Frank family story. The Van Pels family had relatives who were not in the annex, who experienced their own trajectories through the Holocaust and its aftermath. Herman van Pels's brother and other family members were caught up in the persecution of Dutch Jews and suffered accordingly. The story of what happened to the wider circles of families connected to the annex is a reminder that the 8 people who hid in the secret annex were not isolated individuals, but nodes in a web of family and community connections, nearly all of which were also being severed by the same systematic violence. Auguste van Pels had family in Germany who experienced the persecution of Jews under the Nazi regime from its earliest years. Fritz Pfeffer had a son from a previous marriage, Werner Pfeffer, who had emigrated to England before the war and survived. Werner's relationship with the legacy of his father's story, and particularly with the unflattering portrait of Fritz Pfeffer in Anne's diary, was understandably complex. Werner and later his family worked to provide a fuller picture of the man his father had actually been, emphasizing aspects of his personality and his situation that the diary, written from a teenager's perspective, had not captured. The question of how the non-Anne perspectives on the annex experience have been told and preserved is one that has interested historians for decades. Anne's diary is the dominant document, but it is one perspective on a shared experience. The Van Pelses and Fritz Pfeffer had no equivalent surviving record. What they thought and felt and experienced, what their private views of Anne and of each other were, what their hopes and fears and daydreams were in those long, silent days in hiding, is accessible to us only through Anne's account of them, filtered through the lens of a specific and not always generous adolescent observer. This is one of the irreversible losses of history, the subjectivity of the lost. In the decades since the war, there have been attempts to reconstruct these missing perspectives. Authors and dramatists have imagined what Margot's diary might have contained, what Auguste van Pels might have written, what Peter van Pels thought about Anne and about their confinement. These imaginative reconstructions are frankly fictional, and the best of them are careful to present themselves as such. But they serve a real function in resisting the tendency to reduce the other annex residents to supporting characters in Anne's story, and reminding audiences that each of the 8 people in hiding had an inner life of equal richness and complexity to Anne's own. One element of the Frank family story that deserves specific mention is the fate of the family's correspondence and personal papers beyond the diary itself. When Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam and began the work of reconstructing his family's history, he gathered whatever documents he could find: letters, photographs, official records, business papers. These materials formed the basis of what eventually became the archives of the Anne Frank house and the Anne Frank Fonds. The archive is now extraordinarily rich, containing thousands of documents that cast light on the Frank family's life before and during the war. Photographs of Anne and Margot as young girls, birthday party pictures, school reports, letters between family members, all of these have been carefully preserved and made accessible to researchers and the public. One of the most poignant elements of this archive is the collection of letters between Otto Frank and his mother Alice in Basel, and between Otto and his sister Leni. These letters show a side of Otto Frank that the public role of guardian of Anne's legacy sometimes obscures. A son and brother who was also processing grief and trying to maintain family bonds across the distance imposed by the war and its aftermath. They show a man who was, beneath the extraordinary public role he came to occupy, simply someone trying to stay connected to the people he loved. The letters Otto received from readers of the Diary Around the World are also an extraordinary archive. Tens of thousands of letters arrived at his address in Amsterdam and later in Basel over the decades from readers in every country in dozens of languages. Otto answered as many as he could personally, and the replies he sent, particularly to young readers, reveal his commitment to the idea that Anne's story was meant to create a personal connection, that the reader who wrote to him was part of the continuing life of the diary. These replies, now preserved in the archive, are themselves a remarkable body of documentation, showing how one man's grief and sense of purpose generated a decades-long correspondence with the world. Let us now look more carefully at some of the individual stories that complete the picture of what happened to Anne Frank's world after 1945. We have followed the immediate family, the helpers, and the other annex residents. There are more threads to pull, more fates to trace, and more complexity to acknowledge before this story can be said to have been fully told. Hannelie Goslar, known as Hannah, was Anne Frank's best friend in Amsterdam and was one of the most important witnesses to Anne's final days. Born on November 12, 1928 in Berlin, Hannelie had come to Amsterdam with her family as refugees from Nazi Germany in 1933, and she and Anne had been inseparable friends from the time they met in school. Hannelie appears in Anne's diary as an important and beloved figure. Anne dreamed about her, worried about her, missed her. When the Franks went into hiding in July 1942, Hannelie and her family were not yet in hiding. When Hannelie and her family were eventually arrested and sent to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, fate would arrange an extraordinary final encounter. Hannelie's section of Bergen-Belsen was separated from Anne's section by a wire fence. Sometime in the late winter of 1945, when both girls were already severely weakened by starvation and disease, someone told Hannelie that Anne Frank was on the other side of the fence. Hannelie came to the fence and called out. Anne came. The two friends spoke through the wire. Anne told Hannelie that her parents were dead, that she had nothing, that she had lost all hope. She did not know that Otto was alive. Hannelie threw a package of food over the fence toward Anne, but it was intercepted by another prisoner. A second package reached Anne. This conversation, this meeting through a fence in a death camp, was the last time anyone who knew Anne Frank as a person saw her alive. Hannelie Goslar survived Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British forces in April 1945. She was one of the few survivors. After the war, she emigrated to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, and later became the State of Israel, where she trained as a nurse and built a full life. She married 3 times, had children and grandchildren, and became an important witness to Anne Frank's story, giving interviews and testimony for decades. She was awarded the Yad Vashem Honorary Citizenship of Israel designation and received many honors for her witness work. Hannelie Goslar lived to a very old age, dying on October 28, 2022 in Jerusalem. She was 93 years old. With her death, one of the last people who had known Anne Frank personally and warmly, as a friend and a laughing girl in the Amsterdam of their childhood, was gone. Jannie Brandes Brillerslijper was another witness to Anne and Margot Frank's final days at Bergen-Belsen. Jannie, born in 1916, was a Dutch Jewish woman and resistance worker who had been imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen and who knew the Frank sisters in the camp. She later provided one of the most important eyewitness accounts of the sisters' final weeks, describing their terrible deterioration from typhus, their close physical proximity as they faced death, and the fact that Margot died first and Anne died shortly after, apparently without knowing her sister had gone. Jannie Brandes Brillerslijper survived the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. She later worked as an artist and remained active in Holocaust commemoration in the Netherlands. She died in 2003. Her testimony remains one of the most significant documents we have about the final days of Anne and Margot Frank. Rosa de Winter was another Dutch survivor of Auschwitz who provided Otto Frank with some of the first information about Edith's death when they encountered each other on the long journey back from Odessa to Amsterdam. Rosa had been with Edith Frank in Auschwitz-Birkenau during Edith's final weeks and was able to tell Otto something of what Edith had experienced. These encounters on the road home, between survivors trying to piece together what had happened to those they loved, were an agonizing and essential part of the immediate post-war experience. People gathered fragments of information like shards of broken glass, each piece painful, each piece necessary. Rosa de Winter survived the war and testified to what she had witnessed. Her account is one of the pieces of evidence from which historians have reconstructed Edith Frank's final months. Let us also consider the broader context of what happened to the Dutch Jewish community, of which the Frank family was a part. Before the war, approximately 140,000 Jews lived in the Netherlands. It is one of the most devastating and under-discussed statistics of the Holocaust that approximately 75% of Dutch Jews were murdered, a higher percentage than in any other Western European country. France, Belgium and Denmark all lost far lower proportions of their Jewish populations. The reasons for this disparity have been the subject of intense historical debate. Some historians point to the efficiency of Dutch civil registration and record-keeping, which made it easier for the occupying Germans to identify Jewish residents. Others point to the relative geographical isolation of the Netherlands, bordered on three sides by German-held territory and the North Sea, making escape routes extremely limited. Still others have pointed to the behaviour of Dutch collaborators and the Dutch civil administration under occupation as factors that facilitated the deportations. The fate of the Dutch Jewish community is the backdrop against which the Frank family story must always be understood. Anne Frank was not an exceptional victim in the sense of being uniquely persecuted. She was one of approximately 107,000 Dutch Jews who were deported to concentration and extermination camps, of whom fewer than 5,000 returned. Her story is exceptional only in that she left a record. The other 102,000 did not. This is the context that every reading of the diary should carry, and it is the context that Otto Frank spent 35 years of his post-war life trying to maintain. The question of Dutch collaboration and Dutch resistance during the occupation is also directly relevant to the Frank story and to what happened to the Frank family's helpers after the war. The Netherlands had a complicated wartime record. The Dutch resistance was real and heroic and included people like Maep Gies and Jan Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, and Bep Voskoil. But the Netherlands also had a significant proportion of collaborators, including the Dutch National Socialist movement, which had more than 100,000 members, and many ordinary civil servants and policemen who implemented Nazi anti-Jewish policies with notable efficiency. The person who betrayed the Frank family, whoever it was operating in a social environment in which betrayal was possible, and, for some, financially rewarding. After the war, the Netherlands, like other occupied Western European countries, undertook a process of purging collaborators and honouring resistance fighters. But this process was neither complete nor fully honest. Many collaborators escaped serious consequences. The Dutch state's role in facilitating Jewish deportations was not fully reckoned with publicly until much later in the 20th century. In 2020, the Dutch government formally apologised for the role of the Dutch state and its civil servants in the deportation of Dutch Jews during the Holocaust. This was a significant acknowledgement, coming 75 years after the end of the war, that the story of what happened to Dutch Jews was not simply the story of German oppression, but also the story of Dutch complicity. The Anne Frank house in Amsterdam occupies a complex position within this national reckoning. It is simultaneously a celebration of Dutch heroism, embodied in the helpers, and an implicit reminder of Dutch failure, embodied in the deportation of the Franks and 75% of the Dutch Jewish community. The museum has, over the decades, become increasingly sophisticated in how it presents this complexity, moving away from a purely inspirational narrative and toward a fuller accounting of both the heroism and the complicity that characterized Dutch society under occupation. The story of what happened to Anne Frank's family after the war also includes the story of what happened to the Frank family's home and possessions. When the Franks went into hiding in July 1942, they left behind an apartment on the Merwedeplein. The apartment was subsequently seized, its contents dispersed, its history briefly submerged beneath the city's wartime experience. After the war, the Merwedeplein apartment passed through various hands before its historical significance was recognised. Today, the apartment at Merwedeplein 37 has been preserved as a heritage site and is occasionally open to visitors, offering a glimpse into the domestic world the Franks inhabited before the annex. The neighbourhood itself, the river quarter of Amsterdam, where a generation of German Jewish refugees settled in the 1930s, has a complex post-war history that includes gentrification and demographic change and the gradual erosion of the specific Jewish character it had in the years when Anne and Margot Frank played in its streets. Let us return now to some of the other figures in the story who deserve more detailed examination. Among the most interesting post-war lives was that of Maep Gies's husband, Jan Gies, who had been deeply involved in the Dutch resistance beyond just his support for the hiding operation. Jan had connections with resistance networks that supplied food coupons and other resources, and he had lived throughout the occupation in the constant risk of arrest. After the war, Jan Gies returned to his work as a social worker with Amsterdam's municipal government, quietly resuming a life of public service. He was not, unlike Maep, a public figure in the post-war years. He appeared occasionally in interviews alongside Maep, but was generally content to let her be the spokesperson for their shared experience, Jan Gies died on January 26, 1993 of a stroke. He was 87 years old. His death came just after the release of Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List, which revived popular interest in the stories of Holocaust rescue and resistance. Jan lived long enough to see the transformation of Holocaust memory in the late 20th century, the great wave of documentation, film, and public commemoration that swept through Western culture from the 1970s onward. He had been part of a story that the world had come to regard as one of its most important moral parables, and he had borne that relationship with characteristic Dutch matter-of-factness. Another figure worth following in detail is the story of Carl Josef Silberbauer, the Austrian-born detective who led the raid on the secret annex on August 4, 1944. Silberbauer was a member of the Austrian police who had joined the SS and was working for the security service in Amsterdam when he received the order to go to Prinsengracht 263. He was present when the 8 annex residents were arrested. After the war, Silberbauer disappeared back into Austrian society. He returned to the Vienna police force, apparently having been cleared during the initial denazification processes, and continued working as a policeman. He was remarkably not identified as the arresting officer in the Frank case for many years. It was the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal who tracked Silberbauer down in 1963, nearly 20 years after the raid. Wiesenthal had been given Silberbauer's name by someone who had been present at the arrest, and after considerable investigation, he located Silberbauer working as an inspector in the Vienna Police Criminal Division. When Wiesenthal revealed Silberbauer's identity, it caused a significant public sensation, partly because it provided a human face for the faceless machinery of the Frank family's arrest, and partly because it raised questions about how so many former Nazi perpetrators had re-entered ordinary civilian life without accountability. Silberbauer was temporarily suspended from his police duties while an investigation was conducted. He admitted freely that he had carried out the raid on Prinsengracht 263 and had arrested the 8 residents of the annex. He expressed no remorse and seemed genuinely surprised by the attention. He told investigators and journalists that he had been following orders, that it had been his job, and that he had no personal animus against the Franks. He was eventually cleared of criminal charges, in part because his role had been that of a subordinate officer, following instructions rather than an organizer or instigator of persecution. He was reinstated to the Vienna police force. Carl Josef Silberbauer died in 1972. He never stood trial for his role in the Frank family's arrest and deportation. The case of Silberbauer illustrates one of the most troubling aspects of post-war justice, the sheer number of individuals who participated at the operational level in the persecution of Jews and other victims of the Holocaust, and who were never held accountable. The big trials, Nuremberg and its successors, dealt with the architects and senior commanders of the Nazi system. The vast middle tier of functionaries, policemen, transportation officials, camp guards and informants often escaped any reckoning. Silberbauer was just one of thousands. Let us now consider the ways in which the Frank family story has been carried forward by the people and institutions that survived. The Anne Frank Fonds, established by Otto Frank in Basel in 1963, continues to operate. Its mandate is to manage the rights to Anne's diary and to use the proceeds for projects that promote human rights and tolerance. The Fonds has funded Holocaust education programs in numerous countries, supported research into the history of the diary and the annex, and engaged in the ongoing work of keeping Anne Frank's story alive and relevant for new generations. The relationship between the Anne Frank Fonds in Basel and the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam has been one of the interesting structural realities of the legacy. The two organizations share a subject and a name, but operate separately, with different legal structures, different geographic bases, and somewhat different institutional cultures. The Fonds is primarily concerned with the diary as a literary and educational document. The House is primarily concerned with the physical site and the museum experience. There have been periods of tension between them over questions of authority and interpretation, but both have contributed enormously to the preservation and transmission of the Frank story. The Anne Frank House has also, in recent decades, engaged directly with some of the more difficult questions about Anne Frank's story. Its researchers were involved in the 2022 cold case investigation into the betrayal of the annex, providing access to archives and support for the investigative team. The House has developed educational materials that address not just the inspiring elements of the Frank story, but also its more troubling dimensions. the failure of the Dutch state, the role of collaborators, the fate of the victims who left no diary, the complexity of life under occupation. These efforts represent a maturation of the institutional approach to the story, moving beyond simple commemoration toward more demanding historical engagement. Among the stories that the Anne Frank legacy has helped bring to light is the broader history of Jewish life in the Netherlands before the war. Amsterdam had been home to a flourishing Jewish community for centuries. The Portuguese Jewish community that had settled in Amsterdam in the 17th century had produced Spinoza and had built the magnificent Portuguese synagogue that still stands in the city. Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe had settled in later centuries, creating a vibrant working-class Jewish neighbourhood in the east of the city. German Jewish refugees like the Franks had arrived in the 1930s as the Nazi persecution intensified. This community, this centuries-deep layering of Jewish life in Amsterdam, was nearly obliterated by the Holocaust. The Frank story is one thread of that tapestry, and the Anne Frank house has helped ensure that the other threads are not entirely forgotten. The Franks' pre-Amsterdam life in Frankfurt also deserves brief consideration. Frankfurt had been one of the great centres of Jewish life in Germany for centuries. The city's Jewish community had a history stretching back to the Middle Ages, had survived centuries of discrimination and periodic violence, had produced some of the most distinguished figures of European Judaism, and had been thoroughly integrated into German civic and cultural life by the early 20th century. The Frank family was a product of this world. They were Germans. They were Jewish, they were proud of both identities, and the rise of Nazism confronted them with the demand that they choose between those identities, or more terrifyingly, that they accept the Nazi determination that their Jewish identity trumped everything else about them and marked them for destruction. Frankfurt's Jewish community was destroyed by the Holocaust. The institutions, the synagogues, the schools, the community organizations, the cemeteries, the whole fabric of centuries of Jewish life was either destroyed outright, as on Kristallnacht in November 1938, or dismantled systematically in the years that followed. After the war, a small Jewish community rebuilt itself in Frankfurt, and today the city has once again a significant Jewish population. But it is a fundamentally different community from the one into which Otto Frank was born in 1889. The world that made the Franks no longer exists. It was destroyed, like the Franks themselves, with deliberate efficiency. The question of memory and of how the Frank family story fits into the broader architecture of Holocaust memory is one that scholars and educators and survivors' families continue to grapple with. The diary has sometimes been accused of having so dominated public understanding of the Holocaust that it has inadvertently created a partial and potentially distorting picture. The Holocaust was not primarily a story of hiding and discovery. It was primarily a story of mass murder, of industrialized killing and extermination camps, of shooting pits in the forests of Eastern Europe, of ghettos liquidated with methodical violence. Anne Frank's story, for all its power, represents a path through the Holocaust that was available only to the relatively privileged few who had resources, connections, and the support of non-Jewish helpers. The millions who were deported directly from train stations to gas chambers, who had no helpers and no hiding place and no diary, must not be forgotten in the shadow of Anne Frank's particular story. Otto Frank understood this, and he said so, repeatedly. He was consistent in his insistence that Anne was one of 6 million, not a representative of them all, and that her story should be a gateway to understanding the Holocaust in its full dimensions, rather than a substitute for that understanding. He welcomed the use of the diary in schools, but always urged that it be accompanied by historical education about the broader context. Whether that intention has always been fulfilled in practice is another question. The diary is so powerful, so personal, so immediate, that it has a tendency to absorb all the attention it receives, leaving less room for the harder and less accessible history that surrounds it. The Anne Frank story has also been told and retold in numerous artistic and cultural forms beyond the original diary. Plays, films, novels, graphic adaptations, operas, documentaries, exhibitions. The Frank story has been a cultural touchstone for more than 7 decades. Some of these adaptations have been celebrated, and some have been criticised. The 1959 film, based on the Broadway play, was criticised by some scholars for its tendency to universalise the story and minimise its specifically Jewish dimension. George Stevens, the film's director, had been one of the Allied filmmakers who documented the liberation of Dachau concentration camp, so he was not without historical awareness. But the pressures of the entertainment industry and of American cultural politics in the 1950s shaped the adaptation in ways that not everyone found faithful to the original. More recent adaptations have generally been more attentive to the specific historical and cultural context of the story. The 1995 documentary Anne Frank Remembered, directed by John Blair, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary and provided a rich and historically grounded account of the Frank story through interviews with survivors, including Miep Gass and Hannelie Goslar. It remains one of the best documentary accounts of the story. There have also been attempts to tell the story from new angles, to imagine what Margot's diary might have looked like, to trace the broader family history, to document the helpers and the other annex residents with the same depth that has been devoted to Anne herself. What all of these cultural engagements share, despite their differences of emphasis and approach, is the recognition that Anne Frank's diary represents something unique in the literature of the Holocaust. A document that manages to be both a historical record of extraordinary precision and a work of genuine literary art, a teenage girl's private thoughts that also constitute one of the most important accounts of what it meant to be human under conditions designed to deny humanity. The diary works because Anne Frank was a gifted writer. It also works because she was a child, and because the specificity of her individual voice cuts through the numbing effect that statistics and abstractions can produce. We read her and we know her. We know her and we grieve her. We grieve her and we are compelled to ask how this was allowed to happen. That question, how this was allowed to happen, is the question that every generation must answer for itself. And it is the question that all the surviving members of the Frank family and the circle around them have spent their post-war lives helping the world to ask. Otto Frank, Miep Gies, Hannelie Goslar, Eva Schloss, Buddy Elias, each of them, in their different ways and through their different lifetimes, carried the weight of the question and the obligation to keep it alive. They did so with varying degrees of public visibility, but with a shared commitment to the idea that what happened to Anne Frank and to 6 million others must never be forgotten, and must never be allowed to seem inevitable or inexplicable or irreversible. Eva Schloss, still alive as this video is made, continues that work. She has spoken in schools, to governments, at commemorations. She has been frank about the difficulties of survival, the guilt of having lived when others did not, the complicated emotions of having been chosen by fate in a world where fate seemed randomly murderous. She has also spoken about reconciliation, about her eventual willingness to meet with and speak to the children and grandchildren of former Nazis, about the complex question of whether and how responsibility passes between generations. She has been criticised by some for being too forgiving and praised by others for modelling a kind of human generosity that the history of the Holocaust makes almost impossibly difficult. The children and grandchildren of the Frank helpers are also part of the continuing story. The children of Miep and Jan Gies, of Johannes Kleiman, of Victor Kugler, of Bep Voskuil, they grew up knowing that their parents had done something extraordinary, and they have carried that knowledge and its implications forward. Joop van Wyk, Bep Voskuil's son, published his account of his mother's role in the hiding operation and put forward his theory about the betrayal of the annex, as we mentioned earlier. His engagement with the story was partly an act of filial loyalty and partly an attempt to ensure that his mother received the full credit and understanding that her courage deserved. It is worth pausing as we near the end of this long account to consider what the cumulative weight of all these individual stories adds up to. The secret annex was a space of approximately 525 square feet. 8 people lived in it for more than 2 years. 5 of those 8 people died in the Holocaust. The one survivor, Otto Frank, spent the rest of his very long life transforming his daughter's diary into one of the world's most powerful educational tools. The helpers who made the annex possible lived out their post-war years carrying the experience of extraordinary moral courage, and in some cases, extraordinary trauma, each in their own way. The extended family that survived scattered across Europe and built new lives from the ruins of the old. The story of what happened to Anne Frank's family after World War II is thus not a simple story with a clear shape. It is a web of individual trajectories, some ending in tragedy, some in quiet survival, some in remarkable public purpose. It is a story about grief and memory and the uses of testimony. It is a story about how a document can become larger than its author, and how that process, while sometimes distorting, can also carry something true and irreducible into the future. It is a story about the question that Anne Frank herself asked in her diary, in words that have echoed around the world for 70 years. Will this world one day become good again? Anne Frank did not live to find out, but the people who survived her, the father who read her diary weeping and decided to share it with the world, the helpers who kept faith with their hidden friends and with the evidence of their bravery, the cousins and friends who grew old carrying her memory, the millions of readers who have been changed by her words, all of them are part of the answer. Not a complete answer, not a comfortable answer, but an answer that refuses to give up. The story of the Frank family after World War II is ultimately the story of what human beings do with the wreckage of catastrophe. Some rebuild, some remember, some testify. Some work to ensure that the conditions for catastrophe are never again allowed to develop. All of them, in different ways and in different measures, honour the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. And Anne Frank, the 15-year-old girl who wrote in a diary about wanting to go on living even after everything had been taken from her, has not been forgotten. She will not be forgotten. Her words and the story of what happened to everyone around her will continue to be read and debated and taught and mourned and celebrated as long as human beings need, reminding of what we are capable of doing to each other and of what we are capable of doing for each other when we choose to be brave. The broader story of how the Netherlands has reckoned with its wartime history is also an important context for understanding the Frank family legacy. The Dutch process of coming to terms with the Holocaust has been neither simple nor swift. In the immediate post-war years, there was a tendency in Dutch society to emphasize resistance and heroism and to minimize collaboration and complicity. The narrative of the Netherlands as a nation of resistors, embodied in figures like Maip Gies and her colleagues, was comforting and partly true but also incomplete, and in some respects misleading, about the scale of Dutch participation in the persecution of Jews. The Dutch historian Lou de Jong began the long process of historical reckoning with his massive multi-volume history of the Netherlands during the Second World War, published over decades from the 1960s to the 1990s. De Jong's work documented not just the resistance but the collaboration, the bureaucratic efficiency with which Dutch civil servants had implemented Nazi anti-Jewish policies, the role of Dutch police in arrests and deportations, and the general passivity of much of the Dutch population in the face of their Jewish neighbours' persecution. This honest reckoning was painful and controversial, but it was necessary. Later, historians built on de Jong's work to produce an even more detailed picture of Dutch complicity. The statistician who calculated that 75% of Dutch Jews were murdered, compared to about 40% of Belgian Jews and 25% of French Jews, pointed to the Dutch bureaucratic and administrative efficiency as a significant factor. The Dutch Population Register, which contained detailed records of every resident's address and religious affiliation, was one of the tools the Nazis used to locate and deport Dutch Jews, with such devastating effectiveness. The Dutch civil servants who maintained and provided access to those records, and the Dutch police who carried out arrests, were participants in the Holocaust even if they were not its architects. This historical reckoning has been directly relevant to the Frank family story in at least two ways. First, it provides essential context for understanding why going into hiding was both necessary and ultimately unsuccessful for so many Dutch Jewish families. The efficiency of Dutch record-keeping and Dutch law enforcement made the Netherlands one of the most dangerous places in Western Europe for Jews attempting to evade detection. Second, it raises questions about the betrayal of the annex that are connected to the broader question of Dutch collaboration. The person or persons who betrayed the Franks were operating in a social and cultural environment in which collaboration was widespread and in which the infrastructure of persecution had Dutch as well as German faces. The 2020 Dutch government apology for the state's role in the deportation of Jews was a significant moment, but it came very late. The Dutch Jewish community, which had been reduced from more than 140,000 before the war to fewer than 35,000 by 1945, had been waiting for this acknowledgement for 75 years. The survivors and the descendants of survivors received the apology with mixed feelings. Gratitude for the recognition, grief that it had taken so long, and continued pain at the scale of what had been lost and never restored. The material restitution of property stolen from Dutch Jews during the Holocaust has also been a continuing source of controversy and difficulty. Jewish families throughout the Netherlands had their homes, businesses, bank accounts, furniture, and personal possessions seized during the occupation. Some of this property was returned after the war, but the restitution process was widely criticised as slow, incomplete, and in some cases actively hostile to claimants. The Frank family's own Amsterdam apartment and its contents had been seized. The full accounting of what was taken and what was returned is part of the broader and still unfinished story of Holocaust restitution in the Netherlands. There is also a demographic story to be told about the post-war Dutch Jewish community and its recovery, or rather its partial recovery, from the devastation of the Holocaust. The Jewish communities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and other Dutch cities were never fully rebuilt. The infrastructure of Jewish life, the synagogues, the schools, the social organizations, the cultural institutions, had been too thoroughly destroyed. Many survivors who returned from the camps chose to emigrate rather than try to rebuild a life in a country that had, in their experience, failed to protect them. The emigration to Israel was significant. Others went to the United States, to England, to other countries, where they had family or where they believed the conditions for Jewish life were more secure. The Dutch Jewish community that exists today is a much smaller community than the one that existed before the war, and it is also a more self-consciously memorial community, one whose identity is partly shaped by the knowledge of what was lost. The Anne Frank house is not just a tourist attraction in this context, it is also a site of mourning and memory for a community that lost 3/4 of its members in 5 years, and that has been living with that loss for 8 decades. Anne Frank herself remains, 70 years after the publication of her diary, one of the most recognised figures in the world. Surveys have consistently shown her to be among the most widely known historical figures of the 20th century. Her face, drawn from the photographs taken before the war, the dark-eyed girl with the careful smile, is as recognisable globally as those of presidents and prime ministers, an artist who lived full and long public lives. She died at 15, having published nothing, having seen nothing of the world beyond Frankfurt and Amsterdam and the camps, having lived a life cut off at its very beginning by the most efficient machinery of murder in human history. What she left behind was a diary that refuses to be only a historical document. It insists on being read as literature, as personal testimony, as a philosophical inquiry into the conditions of human existence under oppression, as a love story, as a coming-of-age story, as a meditation on faith and doubt and hope. It is all of these things at once, and it speaks across cultures and languages and generations with a directness and immediacy that most professional writers never achieve in a lifetime of work. The people around Anne Frank, the family and the helpers and the other hiders, and the extended circle of acquaintances and survivors who touched her world, lived out their post-war lives in the shadow of that document and of the story it told. Each of them, in different ways, carried the weight of what they had experienced and what they had lost. Each of them found different ways to bear that weight, through testimony, through silence, through advocacy, through the private cultivation of memory, through the public performance of witness. None of them were defined only by their connection to Anne Frank. All of them had full lives, full inner worlds, full histories, but their connection to her story gave their lives a particular public dimension that few of them had sought and that all of them navigated with varying degrees of grace and difficulty. The lesson that their stories collectively teach is not simple or easily summarized. It is not just about the importance of remembering, though remembering is important. It is not just about the danger of hatred and prejudice, though those dangers are real and present. It is something more specific and more demanding. It is about the choices that ordinary people make under conditions of extremity, about the difference between the helpers and the betrayers, about what it costs to do the right thing when the right thing is also the dangerous thing, and about what it means to live with the consequences of those choices, for good or ill, for the rest of a very long life. Miepkes lived to 100. Otto Frank lived to 91. Hannelie Goslar lived to 93. Eva Schloss, still living, is in her mid-90s. These are not just numbers. They are decades of continued witness, continued advocacy, continued presence in the world. The people who chose courage in the darkest years of the 20th century were rewarded, if not with simple happiness, then at least with the knowledge that their choices had mattered, that the document they had helped preserve had reached the world, and that the world had been changed by it. In a story with so much unrelenting darkness, that is not nothing. It is perhaps the closest thing to hope that history sometimes allows. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this video helped you understand not just what happened to Anne Frank, but what happened to every person whose life touched hers, before, during, and after one of history's darkest chapters. If you found this video informative and moving, make sure to check out our other videos about the lives and fates of those caught up in World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another piece of history. See you in the next one.